Every ancient culture that tracked the night sky singled out one wandering light as different from the rest. The Babylonians called it Marduk and made it the chief among their gods. The Greeks named it Zeus, ruler of the heavens, the one whose word the other gods could not overturn. The Romans kept the same rank and gave it a new name, Jupiter, king of the sky. Modern astronomy explains all of that reverence as a simple matter of brightness and size. The largest planet in the solar system, impossible to miss, so ancient stargazers built a throne around it. But the Book of Enoch, a text older than the Gospels, doesn't describe Jupiter as a king or a god at all. It describes something stationed, a fixed post in the outer order of the heavens, assigned a single duty, watching a boundary the text never fully explains, and the text says that post has started to weaken. If overlooked scripture is something you can't stop pulling at once you start, subscribe now. Every week we bring back what was left out. The Book of Enoch survives today almost entirely because of one country. When 4th century church councils excluded it from the biblical canon, most of the original Greek and Aramaic copies were left to rot or were deliberately destroyed within a few generations. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never dropped it. It kept the text in its canon, hand-copied it for over 1,000 years in the liturgical language of Ge'ez, and preserved the only complete version of the manuscript that exists anywhere on Earth today. Nearly everything scholars know about Enoch's stranger passages, they know because Ethiopian scribes refused to let the book disappear. The section this video draws from sits inside what's called the Astronomical Book, chapters describing, in oddly exact detail, a structured heavenly order with fixed posts, boundaries, and assigned functions. Most readers skim past this part. It reads less like scripture and more like a duty roster. Positions, boundaries, responsibilities, none of it wrapped in the drama you'd expect from religious writing. That flatness is exactly what makes some researchers uneasy when they sit with it closely. Myth usually reaches for spectacle. This section doesn't. It reads like someone documenting an assignment. Here's what the text actually says, translated as directly as the Ge'ez allows. Among the beings assigned fixed positions in the heavenly order is one described as the greatest of the outer watchers, stationed furthest from the inner light, tasked with holding a boundary against what the text calls wandering fire, bodies that stray from their paths and threaten to cross into the inner heavens where the earth sits. Mainstream translators read this as abstract cosmological language, a poetic way of describing order versus chaos with no literal referent. But that reading assumes the passage isn't describing anything specific. The text doesn't frame this watcher as a metaphor for order. It frames the role as an assignment, a post given to one being, at one location, for one purpose. This is the part most English translations flatten out. The Ge'ez phrase used for this watcher's most distinctive feature, described as an eye that never fully closes, fixed in the same position across the entire text, doesn't read as poetic flourish in context. It's built from the same root used elsewhere in Enochic literature for something that observes continuously, without rest, as part of its assigned function rather than as a figure of speech. Under this reading, the watcher isn't just guarding a boundary. It's marked by a permanent, visible feature, an eye that doesn't blink, as proof the post is still being held. That detail carries more weight than it should, because Jupiter genuinely does have an eye that doesn't close, and modern astronomy still can't fully explain what's happening to it. Here's what scientists have documented for nearly 2 centuries, the Great Red Spot, an enormous anticyclonic storm in Jupiter's southern hemisphere, has been under continuous observation since the 1830s, with some records suggesting sightings as far back as the 1660s. In the 19th century, it measured roughly 40,000 kilometers across, wide enough to swallow 3 Earths side by side. Today, it measures closer to 14,000 to 16,000 kilometers. It has been shrinking, measurably, across the entire span of modern observation, and nobody has a fully settled explanation for why the contraction is happening, or whether it will stabilize, reverse, or continue until the storm disappears entirely. NASA's Juno spacecraft has been orbiting Jupiter since 2016, gathering the most detailed data ever collected on the planet's interior. What it found didn't simplify the picture, it complicated it. Juno's gravity measurements revealed that Jupiter's core isn't the compact, sharply defined structure earlier models assumed. Instead, it's diffuse, described in published research, in the mission scientists' own words, as a fuzzy or dilute core, with heavy material seemingly dissolved into the surrounding hydrogen and helium rather than sitting as a distinct boundary. Nobody fully agrees on how that structure formed. Some researchers propose a giant early impact disrupted what would have been a compact core, one violent enough to scramble the layered structure planetary formation models otherwise predict. Others argue the mixing happened more gradually, driven by convection currents churning through the interior over billions of years, slowly blending material that should, by older models, have stayed separated. It remains an open question in planetary formation modeling, and the data keeps complicating rather than resolving it with each new orbital pass. There's a second complication scientists rarely mention outside technical papers: Jupiter's overall protective reputation, the idea that its gravity simply shields the inner solar system from incoming debris, turns out to be more contested than the popular version of the story suggests. Research from planetary dynamicists, including work out of JPL, has found that Jupiter's gravity sends nearly as many objects toward the inner solar system as it deflects away from it, by perturbing distant bodies onto new, sometimes more dangerous trajectories, rather than simply sweeping them aside. The Watcher, in other words, doesn't just repel, it redirects, and not always outward. The Enoch passage doesn't describe a fuzzy core or an unexplained storm in those terms. It describes something else, a boundary between the Watcher's outer form and whatever holds its post from within, and it says that boundary is where the eye is fixed, unclosing, marking the place where the Watcher's hold on its position is thinnest and most visible. Not a weather system, not a structural anomaly. A pressure point, worn into visibility over centuries. Here's what makes this stranger. Jupiter shouldn't be putting out as much energy as it does. The planet radiates roughly 1.5 times more heat than it receives from the Sun, confirmed by measurements going back to the Pioneer missions of the early 1970s and repeatedly verified since. The mainstream explanation is gravitational contraction, a process called Kelvin-Helmholtz heating, where the planet slowly compresses under its own mass and converts that lost volume into heat. It's a well-established mechanism in planetary physics. What's less settled is whether contraction alone fully accounts for everything Jupiter is putting out, or whether something in the interior is adding to the total beyond what the standard model predicts. Without any reference to internal heat budgets or gravitational contraction, the Enoch text describes something that lines up with this in an unsettling way. It says the Watcher's post generates its own warmth continuously, not because it is being consumed, but because whatever occupies the post is, in the text's phrasing, unspent, a source that gives off heat without depleting itself in the way ordinary fire does. The text never explains the mechanism. It only insists the heat isn't decay, it's presence. Now here's where it turns unsettling in a different way. In July 1994, the fragmented remains of comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 struck Jupiter over 6 consecutive days, the most violent impact event ever observed in the solar system in real time. The comet had been captured by Jupiter's gravity years earlier and torn into 21 pieces by tidal forces before its final plunge. The largest fragments left scars in Jupiter's atmosphere wider than the diameter of Earth itself, releasing energy equivalent, by published estimates, to hundreds of times the combined nuclear arsenal of every nation on the planet. Some analyses of the comet's earlier trajectory have suggested it may have been on a path that could eventually have carried it toward the inner solar system, before Jupiter's gravity pulled it into a new, doomed orbit around itself instead. The event was tracked in real time by Hubble, by the Galileo spacecraft, and by ground observatories worldwide. It remains one of the most thoroughly documented impact events in the history of astronomy, footage and imagery still cited in planetary defense research today, and it stands as the clearest observed instance of Jupiter's gravity intercepting an object that might otherwise have continued inward. The Enoch passage describes something close to this directly, using language elsewhere reserved in the same text for the moment other watchers broke their assigned boundaries and descended toward the Earth. Except here, the direction is reversed. It's not the watcher crossing its limit. It's the watcher holding the line against something else attempting to cross, absorbing the impact at its own post rather than allowing it to pass. The same root term applies to both kinds of boundary crossing. In the source language, whether the subject is a being leaving its post or an object being stopped before it reaches one. Most English translations compress or omit entirely the passage's description of what happens if this particular post is ever abandoned. A brief final line, easy to miss, stating that should the outer watcher's eye finally close, nothing would be left standing between the wandering fires and the inner heavens where the Earth sits. The text doesn't elaborate on what follows. It only states that the post was never described as permanent. It was described as held, for now. To be clear about what isn't being claimed here, this isn't an argument that a literal being is stationed inside Jupiter, and it isn't a claim that NASA has quietly confirmed anything from the Book of Enoch. The Great Red Spot's contraction, Juno's fuzzy core finding, Jupiter's excess internal heat, and the Shoemaker-Levy 9 impact are all real, documented, and only partially explained by current planetary science. But partially explained is not the same as unexplained by any natural process. Ancient manuscripts carry the limits of the people who wrote and transmitted them across centuries, and reading modern astrophysics backward into 2,000-year-old religious language is easy to do and easy to get wrong. Still, it's worth sitting with the fact that a text excluded from Scripture in the 4th century, preserved only because one nation refused to let it vanish, describes an outer watcher with an eye that never fully closes, holding a boundary against wandering fire from beyond, and that the planet astronomers have watched most closely for exactly this kind of behavior happens to carry, in its own atmosphere, a storm that has been open and visible for as long as anyone has been watching, slowly, measurably closing. Jupiter is still out there right now, doing what it has done for billions of years, orbiting, deflecting, absorbing whatever crosses its path, indifferent to what anyone believes is happening inside it. The Great Red Spot is still shrinking, at a rate scientists still can't fully explain. The core Juno mapped is still fuzzier than any model predicted. The next Shoemaker-Levy scale impact hasn't happened yet, but planetary scientists studying near-Earth objects agree it's a matter of time, not possibility. The Ethiopian manuscript is still where it's always been, still describing a watcher stationed at the outer boundary, still insisting the post was never guaranteed to hold forever. Whether that's coincidence, poetry, or something closer to memory isn't something anyone can settle either way. But the next time you look up and find the brightest point of light after the Moon and Venus, it might be worth remembering that the oldest surviving account of what it actually is never once called it a planet.